Good morning, everybody. I'm Brianna Yoakum. I'm currently the Director of Accreditation here at Washington Alliance for Quality Recovery Residences. I also head up the Professional Development Department, and we are so excited to be hosting Trauma and SUD. We have our presenters here, Cameron Fordmeyer and Shane Gulley, and I would love to introduce them for you guys today. So this video is being recorded and we'll have it on our Walker YouTube page as well as our website. If you want to refer back to it, we also will be able to extend the slides to you so you guys can have that as a resource as well. I'll go ahead and get started. So Shane Gulley, he has started training for basic life support and mountain rescue, search and rescue, wilderness survival, and wilderness medicine. He's served 2 years as an EMT, volunteering with local fire and medical teams in the Tri-Cities. He received a BS in psychology with focus in child and adolescent psychology with addiction studies and professional certificate, and a BA in criminal justice with a minor in political science. He's also served as a deputy for Franklin County Sheriff's Office Correctional Center. After a year of learning that his son struggled with autism, he went back to school and he earned an MA in marriage and family counseling. He is currently finishing an MS in clinical mental health counseling with a focus in trauma. The last 3 years, he has worked as a designated crisis responder, responding with the mobile outreach team with law enforcement, then responding directly from the crisis center. He is CISM certified in both individual and group and mental health first aid instructor. He's a nationally board certified counselor, and he carries an international certification as an autism specialist as well as a mental health coach. So Shane has been married for 17 years. He has 3 boys, all of whom are neurodivergent, and a small farm keeps him busy. So welcome, Shane. We're so glad you can join us today. Our other presenter is Cameron Fordmeyer, and he has worked in behavioral health since 2001. He has a master's of education and counseling. Cameron has been a designated crisis responder since 2010 and managed crisis services for Benton and Franklin County, jail and mental health, the prosecutorial division program, and mobile outreach team from 2015 to 2021. Currently, Cameron is the regional administrator for the Recovery Navigator program and assisted outpatient treatment with Columbia Behavioral Health. He's also the owner and operator of Awareness Consulting and Training. And Cameron is a board member for the Benton Franklin Recovery Coalition and chairperson for the Youth Suicide Prevention Coalition. So welcome. Thanks again for being here and putting on this training for us. We're so excited to learn more.
Yeah, thank you for having us. So a couple ground rules. We're going to try our hardest to present a complex issue in a digestible version. And so if we start talking in acronyms or there is a clinical jargon or something that you want clarified, I have the chat up and I can also see you as well. So if you need to ask a question, I'll wait until a good time to maybe after the slide to address those and try to get to all of them. So feel free to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand and maybe I can see that. I know there's a lot of people on the screen, so hopefully it'll come to my home screen if you do raise your hand, but try to put those in the chat. Shane is somebody I would like to bring along for any time we talk about trauma or neurodivergence because he has a wealth of information. And so we are going to, without further ado, get into it because there is a lot of information to get through. So we'll go ahead and get started and let us know if you have any questions.
And I just realized while you were talking about me, I need to update that because I actually finished the Master's of Science and I'm working on the PhD in health psychology.
Nice. Congratulations.
Sounds much better when you're working on something. Let's just keep it that way.
Pretty much. So what we want to do is kind of take an in-depth look of trauma and what trauma actually does to us. There's actually a strong movement right now for changing post-traumatic stress disorder to post-traumatic stress injury. and how we want to respond to that. We also want to touch on transference and countertransference and how that works within a peer dynamic and within the SUD realm. And then what we can do for acute or immediate trauma treatment, long-term trauma treatment, and all the different various forms of trauma.
I do want to bring us back to two of those categories that when we talk about from a peer standpoint or a helping standpoint, when we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder versus post-traumatic stress injury, it's not going to be our job to diagnose. It's going to be our job to be aware, right? So we just want to give you some signs, some symptoms, stuff to be aware of, and also bring you to the transference and countertransference piece, because we all have our own traumas. Traumas are unavoidable. There's always going to be deaths. There's always going to be natural disasters, let alone abuse issues and stuff that happens too with our usage. So from a helping standpoint, I want to draw for you guys those two areas that we'll put a little bit more emphasis on.
All right, so let's get into this. So defining trauma. Trauma is essentially attaching an emotional response to a memory. Like that's probably the easiest way to put it.
Yeah, think about your brain taking a snapshot of the incident, right? And having a Polaroid of that.
Right. So, and not all traumas are traumatic, right? I served as an EMT, saw a lot of things. They weren't traumatic. It was a trauma, but it wasn't traumatic. Now, that being said, there's these other forms. We have the primary trauma, which is that big event. We have secondary traumas, which we're getting firsthand account from, or we have vicarious traumas in which we actually start kind of living that out through the other person, and having that experience. Trauma has this wonderful, unique ability to compound. It doesn't actually just dissipate. It's not like a one-shot wonder. All these different traumas will actually compound, and the brain, what happens when they do is this little green area in the middle there, it's called the amygdala. That's our emotional response, our emotional processing center of our brain. Trauma actually causes that to swell, to engorge. It actually causes a physical change within the brain. The hippocampus is the same thing. It's the emotional memory center of the brain. So when we're born, these two things are innately built into us automatically right out of the gate. We're developing emotions, which the two primary that develop are fear and anger. I'm afraid you're going to leave me. I'm angry because I'm hungry. So these two emotions are really core emotions, and that will be more discussed more a little bit further down the way. But then the hippocampus actually reacts as any memory tied to an emotion. So once we start tying emotions to the memories, they all reside there, and this swells, it engorges. Well, if you notice, there's this little yellow piece right in front of the amygdala there. That's actually the pituitary gland. So if the amygdala swells, what does it do? It pushes in on the pituitary gland, which helps secrete hormones to produce cell structure. So bruising takes longer to heal. Our immune systems aren't as reactive, like all this stuff. The hippocampus is right up against the occipital lobe, the cerebellum, all these things. So balance can be affected, vision can be affected. Like this has a really physiological response when we experience trauma. Next one. There you go. Thank you. So these two main regions kind of work to push into everything else. So up above the amygdala and the hippocampus is the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus actually converts emotional response into a physiological response. So if we have a strong emotional response to something, all of a sudden our heart rate goes up. Our kidneys start releasing adrenaline for us. Like everything starts just kind of running on high. But when the amygdala and the hippocampus are swelled, it actually causes that to do that without having the emotional response. So trauma and stress increase inflammation within the brain. The engorgement, inflammation, this restricts blood flow. what that essentially means is that we have issues where areas of the brain stop getting the amount of blood flow that they're needing, and the oxygen is limited, and therefore the brain actually has trouble thinking and processing, and you get brain fog, and everything slows, and you know we start having these memories start coming back up, and this is where we start getting into the PTSD effects, right? Where we're getting this reliving of the situation over and over because that's getting plenty of blood flow, but the rest of the brain isn't. And so everything from our navigation, we call it actually postural sway, is when the cerebellum actually gets impeded upon, it actually causes us to have a misbalance. And you'll watch somebody literally just walking down a hall and just kind of lean into the wall suddenly. No reason for it. It actually is called postural sway. All of these happen because of trauma. So we have a little video. And I apologize if I'm going really fast. We have a lot of information, so trying to get through it. Maybe we have it.
Are you not able to hear the audio to that?
Yeah, there's some trouble with the audio.
It seems to be angry.
See if
Try stop share and then reshare with, if there's an option to reshare with the audio.
See, this is why I studied psychology and not technology.
how about now?
Yes. Maybe turn it up just a tad bit and you can hear it if it goes any louder. Okay.
I never wanted to get to the place when people would say, "You did it."
Okay, so we can't hear it again, Cameron. So it's all fuzzy.
All right,
Is there
we'll move back to the presentation then.
Yeah, no worries. Essentially what it is it's actually outlining the idea and the concept of how substance use plays a big role in aspects of trauma. So when we experience trauma, we actually, because of inflammation within the brain, we get this hindrance of release of things like dopamine, serotonin, all these oxytocin, all these different neurotransmitters, these hormones in our brain that actually help us feel good. And so we tend to go into this substance use to get these basically just big dumps of these neurotransmitters so that we actually feel better, right? And so that's kind of where it starts. And so that was the the whole purpose of the video is kind of outlining that. But it's fine. We can move on. It's good.
I was going to try to copy it, but I'll put it in there later.
No worries. So, so one of the things that Cameron talked about was we're not diagnosing, right? But when we talk about something like post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress injury, it's good to keep in mind that this is actually a physiological change. This is why we want to refer to it as an injury, because this is an actual injury against the brain. When we say disorder, we have this idea that something's not usable. There's some disability there. And I want to be clear that disabilities, people don't see as being something you can heal from, but an injury, people see as something you can heal from. And so when we refer to it as an injury, we play on this neurolinguistic kind of idea that if it's an injury, I can heal. And that really helps support the individual and their positivity towards growth and healing and achievement.
This also helps when you're thinking about or dealing with people who we perceive as very difficult, right? Or they're continuously making bad decisions, and we just can't wrap our brain around why they're behaving the way they're behaving. If we look at it from this angle, it increases our empathy towards that individual. This person has experienced something, and this something injured them, right? Whether it was a long-term injury or a short-term injury, it doesn't change the fact that they have been injured or they've been affected. And so if we can look at it from that angle, our empathy increases enough to where we can kind of say, okay, this is something that we can work with, and how do we approach this from an angle that we're not being triggered ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm. And that's really a really good point, because it's like all personality disorders are rooted in trauma. So everything from borderline personality to schizoid personality to like all of them have roots in trauma. And so when we're working with somebody who's struggling with these, it's really important to remember that this was caused by an injury. Like this is a direct result of something that hurt them physically. And so it really does boast that empathizing nature in us. One of the things that is kind of the loop here is we end up with this addiction trauma circle. You end up with trauma, you go into addiction, you end up with addiction, you go back into trauma, and you just do this over and over and over, to the point where like there is no feeling of having an out, because you're just in this spiral.
You get that self-medication, you're going to drown it out, but then you're still having traumatic symptoms, but then you self-medicate on top of that to numb the effects, and so on and so on.
Yep. Now, I say that to say there are no bad parts of us. The substance use, the addiction, is working to do something. It is working to overcome something. It is working as a protective factor. We call that a negative coping skill. It actually has a purpose, and it will serve its purpose until it doesn't. We see this with anxiety. We see this with anger. Basically, they become the loudest voice in the room, so we don't have to hear the other voices. We don't want to hear that embarrassment, that disgust, those feelings of sadness, of hurt, of all these negative emotions that we have. We don't want to feel those. And so addiction has this tendency of coming up alongside PTSD to try and protect the person. But it will do that until it doesn't, until it's actually so harmful that it's actually deteriorated. And so I want to make that point clear. There are no bad parts. They serve a purpose, but when their purpose is done, we need to remove it. That is not a ploy to say, go get addicted to something. That is simply stated, we've already gotten to this point. understand that that wasn't a bad part, it was serving a function. So trauma compounds. So when you're in this cycle, you're not actually alleviating the trauma, you're literally compounding it over and over and over until the addiction has to compound with it to adjust and to try and compensate. And that's why the two end up so entwined with one another, is as one compounds, the other will compound. And until you're actually alleviating the trauma, which there's a number of techniques out there to do this. Everything from EMDR, eye movement desensitization and repositioning, to or reprocessing, depending on which area you're talking about, or cognitive processing therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is what I use, I use cognitive reframing within that. But unless you're actually alleviating that trauma, alleviating the emotions associated with that memory, it will continue to compound over and over and over. And then we start seeing a lot more physical ailments. I mean, who here knows that fibromyalgia is rooted in trauma? Restless leg syndrome, rooted in trauma. We actually have seen vision improve when trauma wasn't resolved. Like people's vision, like their prescriptions had to change because the trauma was resolved. Like this is how deep this really goes and how it changes the physiology of a person.
This is why recovery is so difficult, especially for those who have had traumatic experiences. And usually if you do use or have extended use, you're going to have some type of trauma, right? And when the two are intertwined, you learn to cope. And so that's why when you are in recovery or sober living, it is so much more important to learn how to replace those negative coping skills with positive coping skills. You're having to relearn everything about this. The best way I can relate it to something unrelated but related to substance use is self-harm. When you have somebody who self-harms, maybe they cut, maybe they burn, maybe they bite, they do whatever. So often we want to focus on, well, stop that self-harm. Same thing with we do with substance use, we'll stop using. It's like, well, you can't just stop that without replacing it with something else. And the focus on the act isn't as important as why are they doing that? Is it coming from a place that they feel numb? Is it coming from a place that they don't have control in their life? Is it coming that they're drowning out things? What is the actual act that the substance use, or in this case, on the example, the self-harm, is doing for them? We have to find ways to replace those things with positive coping skills that enhance the person's life, that add value to the person's life. So sorry, Shane, keep going.
No, actually, I was getting to that point. In fact, so you eloquently put it there. So, kind of touched on this at the beginning. So we want to take a look at transference and countertransference. When we're talking about being a peer, or we're talking about just support, and we talk about trauma, everybody has experienced trauma. Everybody. It's the same kind of principle that whenever somebody, the first thing they do, they come into my office, I ask them about suicidal ideation. Every single person at some point in their life has had the thought, I really don't want to wake up tomorrow. Okay, bring it in, we deal with it, and we move on. Trauma is no different. Everybody's experienced it. So when in transference, it's when we're working with somebody and they have a shared experience, they'll tend to place their emotions onto the supporter, onto the therapist, onto the peer. And so this often looks like anger, because again, anger covers things. It becomes the loudest voice in the room, so they don't have to hear the other voices. And so they'll often respond in anger or trepidation, fear, the two main core root emotions that we first learn.
So this is extremely important for those of you who have a direct contact, and all the more reason why you should have, or at least be in some form of treatment yourself. This is why therapists see therapists, right? This is why people who are working in the muck need somebody to vent that off of, but also have supervision to check our own muck. right? This is where people get really, really upset that they're using our continued usage when they do A, B, and C. It's like, well, we were also upset with ourselves and all the stuff that we did when we look back and we relate our experiences to their experiences, and then they become intertwined. So we have to keep this stuff at check and keep it at bay. And the only real way to do that is to increase your level of insight, which is probably going to be to have some level of supervision. So if you don't have a supervisor, or you don't have somebody that you trust, or somebody that you're in treatment with yourself to bounce these off of it, I encourage you to do that. That is probably going to be very crucial for you to be able to at least help out in the best way possible.
And that leads to countertransference, right? Because the countertransference is the supporter placing their emotions onto the client. And that gets into really dangerous territory too. Countertransference can have the same effect as the anger and fear response, but countertransference can also have a negative response of things like attraction or feeling too connected and not having that distance. And so it's one of those things that you really want to be aware of and know what your own emotions are and keeping those in check.
This is where we get our bias, right? This is where the people who tug on our heartstrings and we really, really want to help and maybe have the urge to go above and beyond to help them. But this is also the flip side where we really don't like working with a certain type of population or a certain type of person. It goes both ways, right? So we have to keep those in check.
The greatest advice anybody ever gave to me was a professor down at Liberty University, and he said, and I quote, "Let their problems be their problems. We can't solve their problems for them, and you don't want to work harder than they do. You want them to keep pace with you, and so, or rather, you want to keep pace with them, rather. You don't want to be working harder than they are. So let their problems be their problems, because you can't solve them for them." Cycle of addiction and trauma. So we have this traumatic experience, and then this starts in childhood, right? We have ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences, right? Then we have several tests that just kind of dictate what our childhood traumas were like. And I don't know about y'all, but they're starting younger and younger. I mean, mine really hit at 12. There are kids here that, like, a friend has completed suicide and they're 9. Like that, oh my gosh, like they're just starting younger and younger. And so it's ever more important for us to be aware and be responsive to that. It goes into this this cycle of trauma, and then the proximity of the child to the trauma, and then the parent's reaction to the trauma, right? And so if you are a parent, I advise you be very aware of what's going on in your kid's life, because you're going to be the primary support for how they're going to overturn that trauma. Okay. So, have you experienced the following related to your career? Recurring memories of flashbacks or traumatic events, upsetting dreams, nightmares, disruption of sleep, which is very interesting. So, show of quick hands, who here has a great nutritional diet? We're talking like no processed foods, eating all of our greens, making sure that we're getting plenty of beans and proteins, and waiting till evening to have some of our carbs so that our bodies respond slower. Like, who's doing this?
Sarah, you might be the only one. Good job.
Right?
Thanks.
Sleep
It's been a focus lately.
Sleep is a very interesting thing. Anybody ever heard of B3 vitamin? They call it niacin. So if you're depleted in niacin, which interestingly enough, niacin depletes when we use certain drugs, when we use certain medications, when we use certain things, it'll actually absorb the niacin from our system. Now, niacin has this wonderful little thing about it where it helps us produce serotonin, that peaceful, calm feeling. So when our bodies become deficient in it, we like to be in balance. So our bodies will pull from our tryptophan to produce that same serotonin. Now, tryptophan doesn't produce serotonin very well. In fact, it's very poor at doing so, which means that now we've just pulled the tryptophan that is what keeps us in sleep long enough to actually get into stage 3, which is our deep sleep. It's where our heart rate drops to its lowest sleep. Stage 4 is catatonia, and then stage 5 is REM. And this is where that actually occurs, is through that tryptophan. Well, now we have this cycle of lack of sleep where we have certain uppers that we're using that don't promote sleep, and then they're absorbing the nutrients in our system that would promote sleep, and now we have a whole nother cycle. So now we have the cycle of trauma over here, but then we have the physiological cycle of our micronutrients within our body, and the two are colliding, and it makes it even more difficult to overcome. So difficult feeling joy, that's where that's stemming from. So difference in mentality. Now, there's two different forms of this. There's a negative and a positive, right? There's the drama triangle, and then there's the empowerment dynamic. How we think will dictate our actions. Okay, one of the homework assignments, for lack of a better term right this second, that I give a lot of my clients is I want 5 good things a day. Write down 5 good things each day and bring them back next week. And then I want 1 great thing. You hear the difference? I want a good thing and I want a great thing. Again, we're back into that neurolinguistics. Words mean something. Okay,
Yeah,
so
this is one of those things that sounds quirky when you're trying to tell people, right? I always relate this to the reason why prayer is important is because you're putting the words out there. But that is no different than manifesting. People talk about manifesting, writing your stuff down. This is the reason why placebo effect occurs, right? If I think a pill is going to work for me, it starts working. So positive thoughts, prayer, manifesting, placebo effects, whatever you want to call it, it's all the same stuff. We're putting positive vibes out there. We're setting it up. If I can write it down or I can say it out loud, it makes me so much easier to do it or to actually create the activities that would revolve that to be a down the road that I would succeed at doing it, right? So
if I
sorry,
tell
Shane,
myself
keep going.
I can't do it, I'm not going to be able to do it. If I tell myself I can, there's like a 70% increase in likelihood that you're accomplishing it. Like it's huge. It's like dramatic when you look at the studies.
Which is actually how you break the mind-body stress feedback loop. When you get too stressed out, which trauma does, right? And you start circling, we get into fight or flight. And there's also fawn now too, but we get into fight or flight, you get that caveman brain going. There's some other options now. And how you break that is you take deep breaths and use positive self-talk. Now that sounds silly. People are like, whatever, but it's like, how many of you do that when you get stressed out? How many of you stop, take a deep breath, and use some positive self-talk? Very few of us actually do it, which leads to that cycle continuing. So it sounds quirky, it sounds silly, but there is so much more to it.
Well, and that's what I love about these visuals, right? Is that it actually demonstrates the what's really going on here. So like if I'm telling myself, I can help you, let me go help you and fix you, right? We see how many relationships that start with, oh, I can fix them. No, you can't. Their problems are their problems, right? That's the rescuer. The persecutor. What? I'm right. This is always right. I have no fault here. Like you're just coming at me. the poor me mentality, the victim, right? If my childhood was better than I could have, you see how that just feeds that negative. But if I start talking differently, if I actually verbalize things differently, all right, I can do this. This is the creator form, right? It's the, I can overcome this. I can do this. I can get through this. The coach, that how will I overcome this? Now, inflection there is important, right? I can be like, well, how am I going to overcome this? Or I can be like, okay, how am I going to overcome this? I can do this. What can I do to see how the inflection even changes the dynamic of it? And then the challenger, that you can do it, telling yourself, you can do this. You can get through this. You can. When I speak in one way, you can actually feel the level shift. And then when I speak in the other, you can feel it shift the other way. Craziest thing, words actually have meaning.
Yeah, Rob put that in the chat as well. The power of words have strong meaning, and that is so true. Which is why we got to check our internal dialogue as well. You know, especially how we're talking about our field, or how we're talking about our individuals that we're helping, how we're talking about our organizations. All of that stuff will have to do with your mental health as well.
All right, so what we tell ourselves. Bruce Lee, I love Bruce Lee. Okay, if you've ever met me, he's one of my favorite people. All right, side tangent. Dude broke his back and then invented Jeet Kune Do. All right, just saying. If you want a role model, he might be a good one. He said, "Do not speak negatively about yourself, even as a joke. Your body doesn't know the difference." This is what we're getting at. When we speak negatively about ourselves, we actually increase our stress level. Every time our stress goes up, we release a chemical called cortisol. Now, I talked about the uppers before. Have you ever kicked a soccer ball up a hill? That's all of our uppers. Cortisol's kicking the soccer ball down the hill. It is really good at what it does. And there's a few ways we can alleviate this. Number one, positive talk actually reduces the stress, so that it actually reduces the release of cortisol. Number two, exercise. Cortisol tends to get stored in our fat. So our body fat actually is playing a role against us in this. When we burn body fat, we actually are burning cortisol along with that. Number three, tears, crying. We live in a society where crying seems to have this weakness kind of dynamic, and it infuriates me, because three things are contained within your tears. Number one, water. Number two, salt. And number three, cortisol. And not trace amounts of cortisol, marked amounts of cortisol. It's actually a way your body's trying to re-regulate itself. It's trying to release the additional cortisol from all the stress that you have already taken in. So, positive self-talk, exercise, cry. Have I said cry? I meant cry.
This is what
this.
talking about this is one of those things where it used to kind of bug me when people who smoke cigarettes would say, well, it helps me calm myself, it helps me relax. There's nothing relaxing about nicotine. There's nothing relaxing about stimulants. It's the fact that you've removed yourself from whatever stressful situation. You've gone outside and you've practiced taking deep breaths and exhaling. It's the actual breathing and removing yourself from the stressor that's the calming element, not the actual, nicotine in the cigarette that's doing that. But
I love that. So we have two different things. We have acute trauma and we have chronic trauma. All right. So acute trauma will cause it is the immediate. It's the what's happening within the first 3 months. Like, to give you an idea, we per the DSM 5TR, we cannot actually diagnose PTSD until we are seeing symptoms after at least 3 months. That's the chronic. Acute is acute stress disorder, right? Is the precursor to that. And that's the exhaustion, confusion, sadness, anxiety, agitation, numbness, disassociation. And I want to be very clear on disassociation because there has been this diagnosed by TikTok out there of dissociative identity disorder, and I'm going to throw TikTok through a wall, where a lot of folks have gotten into this idea where I have this dissociative identity disorder. I can just be somebody else. Number one, if any of the other identities know about any of the other identities, it's not disassociative. Therefore, it doesn't actually exist, and that's not real. So, I have gotten on my soapbox. I'm coming down now. So, disassociation is actually that feeling of being set apart from it. So, to give personal experience, had to respond and as an EMT and get a and pick up a body that had been in pieces, and so we would kind of disassociate through this black kind of humor. We called it an Easter egg hunt. All right, like this is first responder black humor. You're getting a dose of it. And so that was our way of disassociating from the experience of having to actually pick up this poor human whose life ended very tragically. That's disassociation. That's pulling yourself away from it, setting yourself apart from it. Okay. Physical arousal is a very interesting thing. Going back into the neurology, when we are physically aroused, we actually release what's called vasopressin, which actually is a upper. It's something we get through intimacy. It's something that we get through competition. Like, it's an upper. It's great. In acute trauma, that gets suppressed. And so a lot of things that would have built us up, hey, we're going to the big football party and we used to scream and yell, and I'm not feeling it. Yeah, that's because the vasopressin is being suppressed due to the trauma. And then blunted affect, right? Nothing. Chronic, so more the PTSD side of things, this is where you're starting to see that persistent fatigue, where they can't get out of bed anymore. Like, it's just, they're dragging, there's no motivation, there's nothing. They got no energy. Sleep disorders, sleep paralysis is one of those fun ones that tends to happen here. So everybody goes through a sleep paralysis. Every time you enter stage 4 catatonia, you're in paralysis. Your body's literally catatonic so that it can heal the muscles and everything. Yeah, you don't build muscle at the gym, you actually build it in sleep. FYI. But all these sleep disorders start to stem there, where our heart rate will actually drop lower than our normal heart rate. And when it's trying to transition into stage 4 from stage 3, our body wakes us up because it dropped too low. And all of a sudden now we are in this catatonic state and we are in sleep paralysis. And now we have this fear response, this fight or flight response, and we are going back to sleep. Trauma induces all of this stuff. You can move on. So, how do we change this, right? So there's a rule of 3s. Number 1, debriefing within 24 hours does help. but we don't need to divulge everything. It's just when we talk about a debrief, it's kind of just going over what we experienced and letting ourselves verbally process. Okay. This isn't a going into every emotional response. A debriefing within 24 hours is literally that. It's just a verbal processing of what just happened. Done. Then we enter the rule of threes: 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. If we're going to start seeing the trauma erupt, these are the times it typically will do that. So in 3 days, if you're seeing somebody who experienced a traumatic event and they're in full meltdown, we got some trauma we need to just resolve, right? And we need to start pulling out the emotional from the facts. And so, or from the memory, excuse me, which leads us to what if versus what is. We want to make sure we're talking in what is. Factual, foundational situations, as opposed to, well, what if we'd gotten there sooner? What if those don't help? Those don't help anything. What is gives us a foundation to support. Which leads us to the next piece of signs that the individual's unable to cope with the anxiety, right? Or with the ongoing trauma. So that's, if you think of it in building a house, this inability to cope is our foundation of coping wasn't strong enough and has cracks, and now our foundation is cracking. One of two things: we can either tear the house down, which if you leave them to their own devices could very easily happen, or as supporters, as peers, as therapists, we go in and we reinforce the foundation. We provide more coping. Allowing those involved to talk about their experience. Here's the thing, guys. Some of this stuff is going to trigger us because we've experienced it.
Yeah, this is one of those things that you want to allow the individuals that we're serving to be able to go through, but this is something that you need to be doing yourself. How many of you ever worked on a secure withdrawal management or detox facility or something to where they had a debrief policy put in place when there was a physical incident, right? Or when there was a seclusion and restraint, or there was a violent episode. We do this, but we don't do it for heightened states of emotion. We don't do it for things being thrown or broken. And some people process very differently, where it takes them a long time. They have to think about things. So we talked about that right? The 3 week, 3 month. Sometimes people need to come back afterwards and say, hey, I spent some time thinking about this, and I need to, let you know, or I need to vent, or I need to do whatever. So there isn't a time frame for this. And we have to be aware of that too, that even though we're wanting to provide a supportive environment and allow individuals to debrief, we need to have some debriefing ourselves and be aware of that time frame on when you could have some visceral reactions of that.
I'm noticing that apparently my brain is split in multiple ways on this. Part of this is the SUD, and then all of a sudden, oh, look, first responder. I work with a lot of first responders. In fact, I own a company to work for first responders. So yeah, change first responder to responder or supporter, and you'll be good. But establishing the supports, right?
The way I view that is somebody who's experiencing it firsthand and seeing it, right? Not just the typical job that goes with that.
No, but I know how I wrote it. But it is what it is. I'm ADHD, whatever. Anyways, supports. People have a tendency of isolating when they are just in that low point. Okay? When trauma has driven them to the point where they're struggling to deal with it, they tend to isolate. Bad. We are not built to isolate. what happens when we isolate is we're not getting things like the oxytocin release from interactions. We're not getting our serotonin release from interactions. We're not processing verbally through what happened. Where all of these things get taken out of the equation that are coping mechanisms that help support us when we isolate. So a big piece of how we change things is show up. Number one thing you can do for any person is show up. When you show up, you have now shown that their time, their struggle is worth your most valuable commodity, which is time. I can always make more money. I can always build another house. I can always get another car. I can't make more time. So when I show up, it says unconsciously that I am valuable. Okay. So large group debriefings. Okay. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about traumatic situations, right? Trauma leads to substance use. We get that whole circle. A large event such as Grandview, Washington, 2 years ago, had the Cinco de Mayo party had an open shooting. Dude just started spraying around. Baby was hit. All right. Bad things, and we're still seeing the ramifications from people from that event. A large group debriefing allows people to just vocalize and process what they just experienced. But we can do it as a group.
You'll see this in IOP groups sometimes when you start getting that and people start talking about, even though it didn't happen right after, they start doing large group debriefings and people have that kind of shared response as well in IOP groups naturally.
Yep. And this basically, it allows us to verbalize and process, but then it allows us to also hear. So when we verbalize something and when we hear something, utilizes two different portions of the brain. And the more of the brain that we can use to process something, the better off we are. Writing, listening, speaking. The more that we can utilize the brain, the better off we are in dealing with trauma. Now, smaller group, like mental health first aid circumstances, allow this kind of tighter group where we can go a little bit more in depth. We can provide a little bit more of our emotional response. But you want to be careful there too, because there's a situation called trauma bonding, that when you have a shared trauma, what can happen is you can end up creating what feels like an intimate relationship, but isn't actually. And that relationship won't hold true because you don't actually have that firm connection. And so you end up trauma bonded. So you really want to be careful with doing the smaller group, more intimate kind of settings where we're getting a little bit more into those emotions. And then again, 72 hours, 3 weeks, 3 months, people process differently. So peers should be making contact at least twice weekly to anybody who was flagged within the 72-hour window. Again, that goes into the 3-week window. If you see somebody showing red flag signs that they're struggling with the trauma, increase contacts, show up. And then at 3 months, we're doing the exact same. Approximately 6 weeks of 60 to 90 minute sessions can actually, within CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, can actually help cognitively reframe the stress and acute. But again, if we are just down to brief therapy, we can do that too. 1 to 3 sessions. I talk a lot about micronutrients. PhD, health psychology. Um, a lot of micronutrients get just burned up in trauma, just completely obliterated. On the side, I actually put helpful supplements, good foods. So the L-carnitine, or L-carnitine, yeah, is a really cool one that actually even suppresses or is proving to suppress addictive tendencies. So when we're struggling with substance use, when we're struggling with addiction, L-carnitine can actually help alleviate some of that. FYI. Again, micronutrients play a significant role because we burn through them. Omega-3 fatty acids are the same. We burn through so many of them that increasing that back into our system can really help restabilize the mood. If you want more information, Stanford has some great studies on this. But I included a micronutrient list so that you were aware of the prominent ones that you want to be aware of.
And no, this isn't a pyramid scheme. Shane isn't selling supplements. You don't have to get anything or purchase anything from it.
I wouldn't trust me to make them. So, I'm not a chemist. I deal with neurology and psychology. So right down to it's so the L-carnitine is actually in there. I just saw the little pop up there. It's on the right. We use I can't ever remember the word what L stands for, but it's because it's metabolizable by everybody. Those of us who are neurodivergent have a mutation to the NTHFR, so we don't metabolize things the same way that neurotypical folks do. But I digress.
Rena, did that answer the question? And then Sarah said that she's seen studies for those with PTSD, the flora in their gut is weak and balanced as a result.
Right. Actually, so that plays a huge role, which is why I have like things like yogurt and sauerkraut and like, things that kind of put good microbiomes back into our gut. I can stop on this. Speech impediments coming out here. All right. So I like to refer a lot to the Mediterranean diet, and diet is annoying to me because we don't have a different word for it, because everybody sees diet and goes, "Oh, weight loss." Diet just simply means what you're eating. Words have meaning, dang it. All right. But the Mediterranean diet actually is based around Sardinian diet. Now in Sardinia, the average lifespan is 104. The average person will live to 104 years old. And they have one of the lowest reported depression rates in the world. That's actually where this diet comes from. It's actually a mental health diet. It has nothing to do with the weight loss or anything like that. It's actually based around a micronutrient scale and the top 31 micronutrients. If you are neurodivergent and know that you're neurodivergent, pumpkin seeds, go buy them now. Because they are like a superfood for those of us. A handful of them, for those of us who are neurodivergent, helps tremendously augment our mood. It is amazing. But that's where this comes from. We can actually ingest things that will offset the trauma and the depression and the anxiety and the just with food. Shoot, eggs from free-range chickens actually contain vitamin D. Now, I don't know about y'all, but last time I saw the sun was 3 months ago. So I need vitamin D. So I can either take a supplement or eat a lot more free-range eggs. Now I'm on a farm, so I have my own, but this is how we can utilize this to actually make things better for ourselves and increase things for our clients.
this is very important for those. We used to teach this in correctional facilities, right? Because there is no natural light. So for those of we're working with people who have just been incarcerated for long periods of time, they probably lack this. If you yourself are working in facilities that you get to the morning or working in houses and it's nighttime when you get up and it's nighttime when you leave, this is going to be way more important for those types of workers or types of individuals we're serving.
Yep. All right, moving on.
And Shane, Beth asked, when you say neurodivergent, are you including people with mental health disorders such as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia? And you can have those diagnoses and be neurodivergent, but the fact of just having those does not make you neurodivergent, though. I think I can answer that one.
Interestingly, with the diagnosis of bipolar, you have a 90% chance of being ADHD and comorbid, but ADHD, autism, OCD, dyscalculic, dyslexic, all of those are what are considered the neurodivergent categories. There's a few more too, but so tension releasing exercises. All right, I'm going to teach you something about the vagal nerve. Now, the vagal nerve is really cool. Kind of starts about here and goes all the way down into our gut, and actually almost all the way down into our pelvis. The vagal nerve actually has this wonderful responsiveness, so to speak. There are times when we want to stimulate it and times where we don't want to stimulate it. Now, really cool technique to relieve some trauma response in your body. You can actually lay down flat, hands behind your head, take your eyes and point them to 3 o'clock and hold them. You hold that position until either you sigh, you yawn, or you have the urge to swallow. And one of those three things occurring will tell you that you've actually alleviated that physiological response. It's kind of cool, which means that you're not producing as much adrenaline, you're not producing the cortisol, you're not. It's kind of fun. So when we talk about tension and trauma relieving exercises, there's a number of, and I just included some here. Yoga, Pilates, I can't do either. I was in 3 fights for life when I was in the jail. My shoulders and knees don't work the same way that they once did. There is no yoga for me. But it does help a lot of people because you're alleviating your nervous system from responding. Okay. With kids, we actually have a technique called Superman pose, where we have them place their chest out, shoulders back, like touch the scapula kind of back, and just hands on the hips and take 3 big deep breaths. What we're doing there is we're actually counteracting anxiety, which pulls us forward and causes us to curl in. By exposing our chest, exposing our organs, we're telling our body we're safe. We're not under attack. We don't need adrenaline right now. And what it does is by holding that pose for a good 3 solid breaths, in through the nose, out through the mouth, we actually shut off our adrenals. It actually shuts down the fight or flight response. Now, we teach this to kids because it's a really easy technique for them to remember. Superman pose, but as silly as it seems, you'll remember it. So we created a mnemonic device that way. Are we going to try?
No, I'm not even going to try. I'll put it afterwards. When we send them out, when we send out the slides, we'll have them in there, and so people can check them out then.
Yeah. So there are a number of different exercises and things that you can use to alleviate trauma. Again, 3 things, right? We have exercise, we have positive speech, and then we had, oh my gosh, my brain just went away.
You have exercise, positive speech, and diet.
And diet. Yeah. Wow. Okay. I'm glad that shut down. That was super.
Do
I haven't
your
had the
Superman
coffee.
pose and we'll get back to it.
Haven't had the coffee yet. So, all right. So support system. What is a support system? What does it look like? Okay. So this is family, friends, coworkers, neighbors, spiritual leaders, anybody within our contact network, right? This is where peers come in. This is where clinicians come in because we are part of the support network, the support system. All of my clients get my work number. They can text me at any time. They all have the understanding that I don't respond when I'm off the clock. That's my family's time. But as soon as I'm on the clock, I will respond. And they know I'll respond because I respond. I show up. I understand I'm part of the support system. It's a matter of having the boundary of where I fit in that support system. Okay? So, building the support system, we want to understand these boundaries. What is my personal time versus their personal time, and what dictates a crisis that I need to take into consideration, right?
Again, this is where we practice what we preach. So ideally, you are doing this as well and instilling these, and the individuals we're serving to do this themselves. So it is way important for anybody to do this, but especially you. It's going to be really hard to help anybody if you don't have these core things down as well, and you don't have a support system.
Correct. So, one of the pieces that I'm going to target on this one is social network. This used to mean something completely different. Now we talk about it as Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Here's the thing with all of those. They create what's called a pseudo connection or a false connection, okay? It makes us feel for a moment like we're connected to other people, and then we'll forsake actual physical connection with people. They have a place when we're communicating with other people. So if we are using Facebook Messenger to communicate back and forth, cool, that's a real connection. But if we're just scrolling through, we're actually creating what's called a pseudo connection. I'm attached to them because I just saw their doggy play in the snow. Not a real connection. It just gives us that false sense of it. Okay.
Especially when you're just meeting their representative and their best PR person, not their real life.
Right. This goes as far as to also limit and condition us in our perception. So what these do, if we're just scrolling through, is they will actually cause our ability to focus to lessen and lessen and lessen, because we'll sit and only watch a video for 3 to 7 seconds. And then we'll move on. And when we are working with other people, we need our focus to be there. Because if they need to unload something, we need to be present for it. And if our focus is limited, we're going to be limited with them. And that's not what we want. So again, practice what we preach. These social networking sites are good when they're used appropriately. But if we're just absent-mindedly flipping through them, we need to get off, because it's going to recondition our brain to operate in a different capacity from what's useful for what we do. All right. So peers are I consider in the first responder category. This was not a misstep in this conclusion. Okay. So peers show up when other people won't. This is what a first responder is. Clinicians, we let people come to us. But peers, supports, we go to them in that instance. So we are in fact a first responder in that category. There is a high prevalence of trauma with us because of secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. We want to be aware that we are ingesting, and we cannot become sin eaters. We can't take all of their trauma onto ourselves and then carry that burden. So we need to make sure we're releasing it as we go. We need our own support system, right? Critical incidents happen. as much as we would love the world to be at peace, it is not going to happen. It's kind of like a marriage. If both of you agree on everything, one of you isn't necessary. I'm going to disagree with my spouse. That's just a fact of it. Sometimes we have critical incidents between my spouse and I. I've done something stupid. She's now mad. I call this a critical incident between us. They happen. We can't get away from them. So we need to be aware of how to respond when we are in them, okay? Rule of threes. If we're dealing with somebody who just came from a critical incident, 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. Make sure that sticks in your head, okay? We can treat acute trauma before it migrates to PTSD, okay? So if you start seeing those red flags, my suggestion is encourage higher levels of care. Therapist, life coach, whatever it needs to be, higher level of care, okay? Because if we can knock acute trauma out before that 3 month really hits, we can actually prevent it from going to PTSD. We actually have that ability. Self-care. Oh, habitual online gaming? Oh Lord. How much time do we have left?
That'll be our next webinar. No, I'm just kidding.
Like, I can do a whole thing on online gaming. Like, the way it changes our brains and how our neurology is insane. At present, recommendation through Harvard School of Medicine, Stanford, the University of Sydney in Australia, all of these recommend no more than 1 hour of gaming a day. Okay. Yeah. I'm going to end that there because otherwise I'm going to go way into the weeds on this.
Yeah. No, this can be, for lack of time's sake, right? We'll get into questions and answers towards the end here that we got to wrap it up pretty soon to allow that to occur anyway. So that way you can free range your questions. Anytime you create a sense of community, and gamers will tell you that I have friends that I've never met before in my life and I have close relationships with them. Well, when bad things occur and the only way you communicate with these individuals is to hop on and game, is it really a sense of community, right? And depending on your level of interest or your level of time you're committing to that, does it become a positive coping skill or does it become a negative coping skill? Are you getting on there when you have downtime that normally you'd be doom scrolling on your phone or doing whatever, and that's what it is, and you set a time aside to do that? Or is it something that you're doing all day, every day from, Friday night to Sunday morning, and then you got to get back up to your real life and do that? So it really depends on what the usage and how you're doing that and what sense you make of that, right?
That's okay.
Positive self-talk, Shane.
Let's finish our conclusions here, and then we will get to the questions. So, self-care support systems are paramount in treatment. Okay, self-care. If we aren't filling our cup, how are we pouring anything out? But self-care to me doesn't look like self-care to you. I can almost promise this. My self-care is to pack my backpack, grab my sons, hike up into the mountains, and disappear for 3 days. That's my self-care. Most people don't do that. But self-care is very individual. What do you do that actually alleviates that feeling of burden? Okay. What can I do that makes me feel like I don't have this weight carrying me? That's what you're looking for. That's what we look for self-care. All of us are going to be working within our own communities. And we want to be very aware that this is our community, we want to take ownership of that, because when we own something, we want to take care of it. So when we're dealing with these kinds of big things like trauma, this is our community. We want to make sure we're taking care of it. Okay. All right. So
Gabby had an example, and we'll open it up after this one. We won't spend too much time because, like I said, we could talk about individual addictions, which anything can be addicted to, right? Especially when you start having withdrawals from those. And I see a lot of kids that do have their fair share of withdrawals from gaming, or adults too. I don't want to just frame that it's a kid thing. So Gabby, one of the ways is to seek out, right, and understand what the appeal is. What are they gaining from that gaming, right? Is it a release from stress? Is it a break from society and normal stressors? Is it the fact that it's fun? Like, what is the main purpose that they're getting? Why do they enjoy doing that? And if we can take those examples and supplement those with other probably more successful, more like when we talk about positive coping skills, they have additional positive effects on our life. Exercise isn't just exercise. You're releasing endorphins, you're getting out in the open, like you're feeling better about yourself physically and mentally. There's all these additional positive things from exercise. Well, when you're sitting in no light and you're gaming all day, some of those effects aren't taking occur. So how can we take what is the main thing that they're gaining from that gaming, and how can we supplement or introduce other activities that would still hit on that but have more positive things? That's harder than it is because you'll actually have to take your own bias out and try to put on that empathy hat and really gain what is. And this analogy occurs for everything that we're talking about, though. Same thing with, like, we talked about the self-harm, we talked about suicidal ideation, we talked about substance use. What is the gain from that? That is where we should be putting the focus on, not the act itself. When we start saying gaming's bad, you shouldn't do this, here's all the bad things of gaming, you just become somebody else that's talking all this nonsense and interfering with what I do, versus coming from an understanding point of what is it that you like about the games? What is it that you're gaining from that? How does that benefit you? These are questions of understanding, and then we can use that knowledge to put other things in there that do the same thing but have extended positive, value.
Like I talked about before, right? What's the loudest voice in the room? Whatever's the loudest voice in the room is probably not the problem. It's the other voices it's drowning out that are. A lot of folks that I see don't have an anger control issue. They have an everything else issue that anger is trying to drown out and protect them from. When it comes to gaming, they tend to be hiding. They're isolating. They can live a different life. Why? What's the point? What are they achieving there? What emotions are they not feeling that they don't want to feel? That's where I would be going.
So feel free for question and answer. Either you can put it in the chat or come off of mute and maybe get back on camera. Feel free to ask anything and leave it open-ended, because everything has a trauma response or a trauma-related stuff. So gaming couldn't be that, even though you would say, well, what does gaming have to do with trauma? It has everything to do with trauma. Most of our actions. Go ahead, Jane.
It's a place to hide.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard somebody come off.
Hi, this is LaShawn. Can you hear me?
We can now in bits and pieces, but yeah, it sounds better. It sounds more clear now.
Okay, good. So I have a conundrum. I have a client, and this is basically I'm training you guys, but I have this particular client of mine who We're trying to get the root cause of her trauma and able to help her walk through her she, her primary goal for standpoint because it's a community. And so then trying to help her find another level of her interests are not a part of that. And so I'm interested to see if I have you experts here, like if I can just give you just a little bit more information to help you give me good feedback. So we're housing first. And so when I asked her what a perfect day would look like, on the first day of her moving into her, she told me that she would take all the money that she saved and lay on the floor and enjoy it. And when we talk surrounding usage, she says she has friends there, she knows people there, she has support there. And the cause of her trauma was her son got taken away. Do you guys have any insight as to how I can better help and approach her surrounding community and her trauma and her substance abuse?
So we got in and out sporadically a little bit on that. So let me maybe recap and you can tell me if we heard this correctly. So this individual is in a housing first program. The trauma that is related is due to her son being taken away. And you asked if she could kind of paint the picture or what that may be of what that looks like that she needs, that she would put the money on the floor and roll around in it. And what she got from the community that she was in before is that she knew them and they were supportive. Did I get some of that correct?
Hi, my name is Holly.
Yes.
I'm also with Washington Care Connections.
All of that was correct.
The one thing that you can do, right, is same thing of the type of people, right? Sometimes I've probably felt more connected to the people, and this maybe is a trauma response, to the people that I've done dirt with, or the people who know the darker secrets or the things. And so sometimes you can try to gain of that type of person and what the gain was that and why they feel secure with those type of individuals, and see if there is a shared group in the treatment of people that relate to her, because that's the whole thing of peers, that we speak the same language. So can I get her into a support group, or can I get her into an IEP group, or somebody that speaks that same language, that lives that same life, that can be, but they're also headed in the same direction, right? Whether that's recovery, whether that is establishing employment, whether that is reconnecting with their children, whatever that may be, there's usually a subgroup in that we could hopefully try to find. And if it's not in person, it may be virtual, something that we can do there. Shane, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Well, okay. So basic math, if nobody ever taught you 2 + 2 = 4, how would you do basic math? My guess is nobody ever taught her what an actual positive relationship looks like. So these relationships look like the best thing she's got. But if you were to analyze the aspects of a friend is somebody who builds you up, who wants your best interests at heart. My guess is she never understood that. And so you basically have to teach her what a good relationship looks like. But again, it comes back to, what does she want to change?
Yeah, the motivations, right? If the main motivation is to get their children back, what does that look like, and what do you need to do for that? So even though especially when you see that kind of stuff of like, I'd roll around on money. Well, it's like, did you see that in TV? What would that do for you? You know, is that where did that come from? And so sometimes if we can ask the questions rather than why or you type of stuff, we can say what and how. You can gain a lot of information on how somebody thinks and what that is when you ask those reflecting questions, versus trying to justify why that's even necessary or what is the purpose of that. Because rolling around in money does what? Nothing. You know, I mean, so does that make a sense of security? Does that make the person feel like they'd be happy? What is that sense? And then we can build off of those things, to try to emulate those. Holly, I know, and sorry, LaFonda, if that didn't answer, maybe we can put it in the chat because the connection gets kind of spotty on that end. Holly, I think it was, I saw you come up and have one as well. Can you come back on?
No, that answers the question. Thank you.
Holly, are you still there?
Sorry, I was just coming in to help fill in some information, but thank you.
Gotcha. Okay. And then Gabby had put how to support a person with money issues. For example, the client, they know that they don't have enough or any money. They spend whatever they get from SSI or SSDI, and there is nothing left for rent or food. They jump from apartment building to another apartment building, causing debt, never pay, never save any penny. And how to deal with this is forgetting what happened in the past. They push. Yeah, that is unfortunately a large portion of the population. Most people are financially illiterate at best. You know, we live above our means, we do these things. And so, but that is where you get the shopping addictions. That's where you get the people who spend so much money on Amazon and packages coming in, they forget what they even got. It's like, oh, hey, look what I ordered today. I forgot I ordered so much stuff that this one's a surprise to me, even though you were the one that, you know, shopped for it. So teaching people the value of money as it is only worth taking care of your basic needs and security. So changing the focus from a pleasure standpoint of money, it makes me feel good to spend it because shopping, and it does release endorphins. People do enjoy those, but changing the view of what money really is. And is it a security standpoint, right? If you never had it growing up, it's really hard to say, this is what people who utilize money to build themselves up and purchase assets, for example, rather than liabilities. Do they even know the difference between what an asset is and what a liability is? Do they know basic budgeting, right? And do they set, okay, I got this much money coming in, therefore the best thing I could do with it is have more money at the end of it than more money coming out of it, right? So learning basic stuff that may seem to some people like it's a common sense, most people don't have that. Most people don't budget. Most people don't understand what you use money for. They think it's a tool for happiness or a tool for that, and it's not. That's why people who are successful or wealthy still die by suicide, or they still have depression and anxiety. It is not something that you seek pleasure from. It is something that you take care of basic needs and you provide security for you and your loved ones with. And outside of that, it doesn't have any real value. And trying to establish one of the things that we used to do with wellness recovery action plan groups, or IMR, illness management recovery, for those who are either coming out of the psych hospitals, coming out of withdrawal management facilities, was to do some form of financial literacy, right? How do you create a basic budget? What are the things that have to be paid for? Because if you don't pay for them, you will be out on the street, or you'll go from apartment to apartment. Like, so sometimes using those basic structures of budget setting and also trying to understand the difference between a asset, which would generate positive and make you money in return, versus a liability, something that's going to continually take money out of your pocket.
This is actually kind of why I love working with you, Cameron, so much, because you and I see things from two different points of view. So you just explained eloquently the logical and analytical component of financial support. I come at it as, okay, so what is the lack of impulse control? Where is impulse control coming from? What is the drive? What is the desire to spin? Is it a fear impulse where they're afraid that if they have it, then they're going to do something else with it? Are they like, and this is where I come at that very same question, of what is that driving force? What makes them want to spend it?
And then do we have any future upcoming talks on youth and traumatic brain injuries and SUD? And nothing on the books, but if Brianna would have us, we would love to provide whatever is useful suggestion wise. So it's a great topic area because traumatic brain injuries get overlooked a lot, right? And sometimes when people, especially with escalation, right, or processing, and so people who do have traumatic brain injuries typically lead to certain behaviors and lead to certain self-medicatings of that, and sometimes our normal approaches aren't effective on them for obvious reasons because there's sometimes a connection issue, for a layman's way of saying that, right?
Yeah, I remember that one that we had that everybody kept saying was on the autism spectrum, and actually had a TBI from football, and Sacred Heart finally diagnosed it, and he went from one word responses to actually sitting down and having a conversation with us.
Yep.
Yeah, TBI gets way overlooked.
Great topic. We would love to spend some time talking about it for sure. All right, it's 11:33. Any last questions or anything else for the good of the order?
May I ask a quick question about, because we've covered, obviously the trauma and the things that need to be provided, but then we start talking about some education, like we talked about, like, for instance, financial literacy. I guess my concern as a housing operator that wants to do the very best for the gentlemen that are going to be moving in and dealing with different levels of trauma is it could also seem like if there's a point, if you start dumping a lot of education on them, that could be really overwhelming when they're. So it's like, I guess there's probably not a magic recipe, do this week and this week and this week, but obviously there should be some concern about, when's a good time to teach something versus when's a good time to just be interacting and processing through, maybe the trauma. I mean, obviously I'm not gonna be doing this all by myself because I've got to bring in a lot of professionals, but I want to be aware. I want to be like, okay, I can see not having all the knowledge that you could make a mistake. You could start dumping, education on somebody when really they're not ready for that. So that's just my concern. Is there ways to kind of learn, how to order things, or, what to look for, that they're going to be ready for a specific type of knowledge that is going to be received well, because now they're feeling some self-confidence that they can use it. I guess, for lack of a better way of posing the question.
No, that's a great question. And yes, there is some curriculum for group type homes or rehabilitation living. Because you have to take each individual at what it's at. Now, you can have general groups, right? And those groups hopefully have a flow to them, because you may get an individual who doesn't know how to cook for themselves, doesn't know how to do laundry. And some of those basic needs stuff we get scoffed at, of like, who doesn't know how to do laundry? There's a lot of people that don't know how to do laundry. There's a lot of people who think McDonald's is how you make food, right? So what you have to take each individual's needs and then have groups that are assigned for that in a succession that makes sense, right? How can you meal plan when you don't know how to basically set up a grocery list? So are you just going to the grocery and just automatically buying whatever looks good to you, or do you have a purpose to what you're doing? So really, you have to come up with kind of a flow that makes sense and can be applicable to everybody, but you're right. You're not going to start at, hey, this is what assets and liabilities are before you've learned how to wash your clothes or clean or provide some basic need stuff. Same thing with, like, are you going to go get a job? It's like, have we focused on taking a shower yet in your basic hygiene? You know, and so is there a individual that we can work on an individual plan, but has some group type stuff that actually has to do with them interacting with people in the house, right? Because even though you have individual issues, there's still going to be group living environment. And how do you co-live with somebody? How do you co-mingle? Because you're going to have to clean up after yourself. You're going to have shared spaces, right? So there are some examples of that that are in other type of programs that you can maybe mimic and know, but it's always going to be individually driven, that we're working on individual plans, but also having more of a global kind of group curriculum, if that makes sense.
That's great. Thank you so much.
A big piece of this is I love to teach my clients, know what you know and know what you don't. If your client already knows ADLs, well, then we don't have to deal with that. But if they don't, we do. So knowledge is very valuable. Just assessing that from the get-go is probably a good way to start. Is what do they know?
All right. If there is nothing else, we will feel free to reach out to Brianna. She has our contact info too. And so if there's stuff outside of here that you want, or other questions that you had that maybe you didn't want to ask or put in direct message, we can get back to you at the earliest convenience. But we really like doing these things, and thank you for the opportunity for us to present on a very serious topic.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone, have a wonderful afternoon. We'll be sending an email with the slides, survey. Yeah, any recommendation on future webinars, put them in the survey. We like to collect them and plan them out. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for your time.